The morning Earl Schubert's combine quit, the temperature dropped 11 degrees in 4 hours. That was October 14th, 2003. A Tuesday. I remember because I had just come in from checking the south field, and my coffee was still hot when Darlene Schubert called the house at 7:30. Her voice doing that thing voices do when the person has already been crying and stopped and is trying to sound practical now. She said the header had seized. She said the repair company out of Atlantic couldn't get a man there until Friday at the earliest. She said Earl had 340 acres of soybeans still standing, and the forecast was calling for hard frost by the weekend. Not the soft, manageable kind, but the kind that drops to 26 degrees and stays there for 6 hours and turns mature soybean pods brittle as old china. I told her I'd come over. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I need to back up. Because what happened that October didn't start in October. It started in 1952, in a shed my father built from salvaged railroad ties on the east edge of our property, about a quarter mile off what was then just a gravel track that eventually became County Road F58. My father's name was Harlan Hope. He was not a man who wasted words or money, and he applied the same economy to everything he touched. Fence posts, seed selection, the angle at which he sharpened a blade. In the spring of 1952, he bought the frame and partial drivetrain of a John Deere Model 55 combine that had been damaged in a barn fire outside Griswold. He paid $180 for it. The dealer thought he was being kind to a fool. Over the following 14 months, my father rebuilt that machine. Not restored, rebuilt. He fabricated parts that weren't available. He welded joints that the factory had bolted. He machined 2 pulley wheels himself on a lathe he borrowed from a man named Curtis Albright, who ran a small shop on the edge of Anita. He replaced the canvas and rubber threshing elements with a belt configuration he'd sketched on the back of a Purina feed invoice, a configuration he'd read about in a 1938 extension bulletin from Iowa State that described cold weather grain behavior in terms most people had stopped caring about by the time combines got comfortable and fast. When he finished in July of 1953, the neighbors came to look, not to admire, to look the way people look at a thing they expect to fail publicly and want to be present for. It didn't fail. That machine harvested our fields every season from 1953 to 1978, when my father's hands got bad enough that we slowed down what we were doing. After he passed in 1981, I kept it in the shed, not from sentimentality, though people assume that. I kept it because I had watched my father build it, and I understood what was in it that wasn't in anything the dealers were selling anymore. By 2003, I'd been hearing about that combine for 30 years, mostly jokes. That Tuesday morning, I walked out to the shed, lifted the wood plank door, and looked at it sitting there in the half-dark, just as my father had left it more or less. I thought, all right then. The shed smelled the way it always had. Old grease, dry wood, and something underneath both of those that I can only describe as iron that has been warm and then cooled 10,000 times. The combine sat on the same packed dirt floor where my father had finished it. I had swept around it twice a year since 1981. Not because anyone was coming to see it, just because that is what you do with something that deserves the courtesy. It was October 14th, a Tuesday, cool enough that my breath showed when I pulled the door all the way open and let the morning light reach the front of the machine. The cylinder housing my father had shaped from a piece of boilerplate still had the seam weld you could run your finger along like a scar. The canvas elevator belt, he had replaced it in 1971. The last belt he ever ordered from the co-op catalog had gone stiff but not rotten. The concave bars were there. The sickle bar was there. Everything was where it was supposed to be because nothing had moved it and nothing had touched it with the particular carelessness that passes for modern maintenance. I spent that morning going over it by memory more than by checklist, though I did keep a handwritten list in my shirt pocket. My own list, not my father's. His lists were in the notebook. Mine were for the immediate work. I checked the drive belt tension, pressed my thumb against the canvas elevator at 3 points the way he had taught me to. Looked at every grease fitting. Looked at the pitch chain. Looked at the reel fingers to count which ones were bent and which were straight. 4 bent. That was the same number that had been bent since 1979. I had straightened them once, and my father had told me they would just bend again in the same places, because the reel had a slight imbalance from a field stone it had hit in the autumn of 1967, and that imbalance was not worth correcting, because the machine ran fine with it, and correcting it would mean pulling the whole reel assembly, and that was 3 days of work for a cosmetic result. So I had left them bent. They were still bent. He was still right. What I needed was oil. 2 new drive belts from the standard agricultural supply, not custom, not special order, just B78 and B92, V-belts that any decent shop carried in the back, and about 4 hours of careful work before I would know whether the engine would turn. The engine was a 4-cylinder Continental, not the original, but a replacement my father had sourced from a wrecked orchard sprayer in 1964. He had written about that in the notebook, too. Said it was a better fit than what the original called for, because the torque curve was flatter at low RPM, which mattered when the crop was heavy, and you needed the cylinder speed to stay even without lugging. I had read that entry probably 40 times over the years. I had never thought I would be standing here reading it in my head, while deciding whether to stake my neighbor's farm on what it described. I stood there in the barn for what must have been 10 minutes, just holding the notebook open to that page. The light through the west window had gone pale and flat, the way it does when the temperature drops fast, and I could hear the wind picking up along the eaves. October 14th. I had 2 weeks before Carl Eberhardt's extension deadline from First National in Atlantic, and the frost had already taken most of what was standing in his east field. What was left was frozen stiff at the stalk, brittle in a way that would shatter the heads right off if you ran a modern machine through it at anything above minimum cylinder speed. That was the problem nobody at the dealership wanted to say out loud. I'd been over to Knapp's Farm Equipment on the 9th, the day after the frost hit. Carl had gone with me, his hands in his jacket pockets, not saying much. The new Case IH they had on the floor, the 713, oh, a fine machine, I won't argue otherwise, ran a rotor speed you couldn't drop low enough without triggering the automatic compensation system, which would then ramp it back up. It was designed to protect yield in normal conditions. In these conditions, it would beat the brittle grain into powder before it ever reached the tank. The young service manager, fellow named Denton, had explained this patiently, like he was explaining weather to a child. He said there was no override. He said the software didn't allow it. He said he was sorry about the situation, but there wasn't much they could do with 2 weeks until the deadline. Carl had nodded and said thank you, and we had driven back to his place on County Road F44 without speaking. That evening, I told him about the Continental engine, about the flat torque curve, about the cylinder speed my father had noted in the margin, 420 revolutions per minute at load, written in pencil, with a small asterisk that led to a note at the bottom of the page. Holds clean at 380 in wet or damaged crop without boll loss. Carl had sat at his kitchen table and looked at me for a long time. His wife, Ruth, had brought coffee and then left us alone, which told me she already knew how serious it was. I told him I couldn't promise anything. I told him the belts needed replacing and the feeder chain wanted adjustment, and I hadn't run the machine under full load, since the fall of 2019. I told him that a 60-year-old combine with a salvaged engine and hand-welded seams was not what any sensible man would stake a farm on. He said he understood all of that. Then he said, "What would your father have done?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at the coffee cup. I looked at the window above his sink, black with the night outside. I said my father would have gone home and changed the belts. So that is what I did. I drove home at 10:30 on a Tuesday night, October 14th, pulled the truck around to the east side of the barn, and flipped on the drop light. The belts I needed were not on the shelf. I had known that when I said it, and I had said it anyway because the alternative was standing in Carl's kitchen making promises I wasn't sure I could keep, and that felt worse than the drive back in the dark. I had 3 belts in inventory. 2 were the right width, but 6 inches short, and 1 was the correct length, but had a hairline crack along the inner edge that I'd been meaning to deal with since spring. I set them on the workbench and looked at them the way you look at a poker hand you didn't expect to play. There is a parts dealer in Atlantic, Iowa, 14 miles east on Highway 6, a man named Dale Sutter, who has been running the same gray cinderblock building since 1987 and keeps an inventory that would embarrass most modern warehouses. Dale doesn't advertise. You either know about Dale or you don't. His hours are 7 to 4, Monday through Saturday, and he does not answer the phone after closing time, which means I would be standing at his door at 7 the next morning. I slept 4 hours, maybe less. I was in Dale's lot at 6:50, sitting in the truck with the engine off, watching the frost come off the hood in thin curls. At 7:02, the light inside went on. I had the belt specifications written on the back of a Phillips 66 receipt, and Dale found what I needed without going to a catalog. He had 4 of them on a wooden peg in the third aisle. Gates brand, the old agricultural spec, manufactured for equipment that no longer existed in the eyes of most dealers. He charged me $41 for the pair and said nothing about what I was working on, which is one of the reasons I have bought from Dale for 30 years. I was back at the barn by 8:15. The belt swap on the main separator took most of the morning. The feeder chain adjustment was 20 minutes once I got the cover plate off. But the cover plate had a stripped bolt that cost me another 45 minutes and some language I won't repeat here. By noon, I had the engine running and the separator spinning, and I stood back and listened the way my father taught me to listen, not for what was loud, but for what was quiet that shouldn't be. It sounded right, not new, not factory floor right, but the kind of right that a machine earns after 60 years of honest work. A sound like a man who has walked 10,000 miles settling into a familiar chair. I called Carl at 12:30 and told him I would have the combine at his field by 7 the next morning. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "I'll have the coffee on." I drove the combine over to Carl's place that evening instead of waiting for morning. 7 miles on County Road F58, just after sunset. The kind of sky that goes orange, then purple, then the color of a bruise before it goes dark entirely. I don't like moving equipment in the morning when the dew is still heavy. The stalks take up moisture overnight, and by dawn, the grain is sitting different than it will be. By mid-morning, my father knew that. I know that. A man at the John Deere dealership who has sold combines for 11 years probably doesn't know that, because nobody told him and he never had reason to find out. Carl was standing at the end of his drive when I came up the road. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and he was watching the headlights of the 55 coming toward him. The way you watch something you're not entirely sure is real. I pulled up alongside his fence post and cut the engine. The quiet came back in around us, crickets still going. A dog somewhere to the east, the tick of cooling metal. He walked around the machine slowly. Didn't say anything for a while. Then he put his hand flat on the side of the feeder house, The way you touch an animal you weren't sure about. She'll run, I told him. She ran this morning and she'll run tomorrow. He nodded. He wasn't doubting me exactly. He was just doing the math in his head that any farmer does when someone else's equipment shows up to do the work his own couldn't. Calculating what it means, what it costs, what he owes. I knew that math. I've run it myself. We walked the field together in the dark with flashlights. 14 acres of corn standing in rows that had gone rigid in the cold. Stalks brittle as old wood. Ears hanging at hard angles. Carl kicked at a stalk near the fence line, and it snapped like dry kindling. He shone his light along the row and shook his head. Modern pickerhead won't touch this, he said. The rollers jam up on brittle stalk. I watched it happen Tuesday morning on my son-in-law's machine. Threw a roller in the first 20 feet. I know, I told him. The old 55 uses a different geometry altogether. The gathering chains on that machine are gentler. Not gentle by design, but gentle by limitation. Slower, lower torque, a different angle of attack on the stalk. It's not smarter than the new equipment. It's just built around different assumptions from an era when the corn came in later and colder, and the machinery had to meet the crop where it was, not ask the crop to meet the machinery. We stood there in Carl's frozen field at 9 o'clock at night in the first week of November 2009. 2 old men with flashlights, and I explained this to him the way my father once explained it to me, standing in a field that smelled just like this one. Cold dirt, dead leaves, something sharp underneath from the frost. He listened the way good farmers listen, without interrupting. Carl asked me one question when I finished. He said, "Will she hold?" I thought about that for a moment. Not performing thought, actually thinking. Because the honest answer was, I didn't know. The 55 hadn't run a full field in 11 years. The last time she'd worked hard was the fall of 1998, when I put her through 60 acres of late-planted corn that had no business being harvested in October. She'd done it, but that was 11 years ago, and 11 years is a long time in the life of a machine that was already old. She held in 98, I said. She held for my father in 67 when the header seized on his new Oliver, and he had to bring the 55 back out of the shed to finish the season. She held in 71 through a wet October that rotted out 3 other combines in this county. I paused. I can't promise you tomorrow, but I can tell you her history. Carl nodded. That was enough for him. We drove back to my place in his truck, the heater running loud, neither of us talking. The fields on either side of the road were dark and flat, the kind of flat that makes you feel like you could see all the way to Kansas if there were any light to see by. I was running through the machine in my mind. The belts I'd replaced in 2004. The cylinder bearings I'd packed in 2006. The gathering chains I'd adjusted the spring before last, just out of habit. The way old farmers adjust things out of habit, even when there's no immediate reason. I was glad I had that habit now. We got to my barn at 10:15. I turned on the overhead lights, the fluorescents that buzz and flicker before they catch, and there she sat. The John Deere 55. Green gone dusty, the decals faded to almost nothing. The header folded back the way I always leave her in storage. She looked tired. She looked like what she was. A 57-year-old machine built by a man who'd been dead for 31 years. Held together with welds and judgment and a stubbornness that neither one of them, the man or the machine, ever bothered to apologize for. Carl stood at the barn door and looked at her for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "She's something." "She is," I said. I started my pre-check at 10:30. Not a quick walk around, a real check. Every belt for cracking, every chain for stretch, every grease fitting. the cylinder drive, the feeder house, the elevator chain. I worked with a flashlight in one hand and a grease gun in the other, the cold coming through my jacket, my breath fogging in the light. Carl handed me tools without being asked. He didn't know what I needed next, but he watched close enough that he learned fast. By midnight, I was satisfied. Not certain. Satisfied. There's a difference, and any honest farmer knows it. I told Carl to go home and sleep 4 hours. I told him to be back at 4:30 in the morning, dressed for cold, with a full thermos and whatever prayers he had left. He was back at 4:22. I know because I heard his truck turn off County Road F38 before he even hit my lane, and I checked my watch out of habit. Old farmers check watches the way other men check their phones. Not for the time exactly, but for the confirmation that the world is still moving in sequence. The temperature had dropped to 19 degrees overnight. I had known it would. The forecast said 23, but I have lived on this ground long enough to know that the bottomland where Carl's East Field sits pulls cold the way a low bowl pulls water. It always runs 4 degrees colder than whatever the radio tells you. That field was 19 degrees, maybe 18 by dawn, and the stalks that were still standing out there were carrying grain that had been frozen hard and thawed twice in the last 10 days. Brittle as old ceramic. That was the whole problem, and the whole answer. At the same time, modern concave clearances are set for a reason: efficiency, throughput, speed. But grain that brittle will shatter before it threshes if you push it too hard or too fast. The newer machines, the ones Carl had tried to hire in from 3 counties over, they were running cylinder speeds and concave gaps tuned for the center of the bell curve. For normal grain in a normal October. This was not normal grain in a normal October. My father's combine had no such ambitions. The cylinder on a 1952 machine runs slower by design, and the concave clearance is adjusted by hand, by feel, really, with a wrench and patience, and the sound the grain makes when you get it right. You listen for a particular quality of separation, a clean sound rather than a crushing one. My father had described it to me as the difference between a handshake and a fistfight. You want the grain to let go of the cob, not to be beaten off it. I had set that clearance myself at 11:15 the night before, kneeling in the cold with my ear close to the mechanism, turning the adjustment bolt 1/8 of a turn at a time. Carl had watched me and not spoken, which was the right instinct. We pulled out of my lane at 4:50 in the morning. I drove the combine and Carl followed in his truck with the grain cart, his headlights coming up behind me in the side mirror, steady as a heartbeat. The road was empty. The sky was that particular deep blue-black that comes in the last hour before dawn, when the stars are still hard and bright, and the horizon has not yet decided what it wants to be. I turned onto his field approach at 5:04. The corn was standing there in the headlights, frosted white on the north-facing sides of every stalk, row after row of it going back into the dark. A field that had been written off by the bank, by the adjuster, by the hired men who had shaken their heads and driven away. I sat there for a moment with the engine at idle, feeling the old machine vibrate underneath me the way it always has, steady and deliberate, like something that has made up its mind. Then I dropped the header, eased in the clutch, and started down the first row. The corn came in brittle and cold, the way frozen grain does, not with the soft rustle of a good October harvest, but with a sharp cracking sound, almost like walking on ice. The stalks snapped at the header rather than folding. A modern machine would have choked on it inside of 20 feet. The sensing systems would have flagged the moisture content, the internal temperature, and the whole operation would have shut itself down with a blinking error code nobody on that field knew how to override at 5 in the morning. But my father's combine didn't know about error codes. It knew about belts and gravity and a threshing cylinder that turned at exactly the right speed because a man in 1952 had set it that way with a wrench and 40 years of judgment behind his hands. The grain came through cold, and it came through clean. I watched the returns elevator in the mirror, barely a kernel going back for a second pass. The machine was eating that frozen field like it had been waiting for exactly this job its whole life. I ran 18 rows before the sky went gray, ran 18 more before the sun broke the tree line to the east and threw long orange light across what was left standing. Earl came out of the house at 7:30 in his barn coat, coffee in hand, and he stood at the field edge for a long time without saying anything. I made my turn at the far end and came back toward him, and when I got close enough, I could see his face. He wasn't a man who cried easily. He didn't cry then. But there was something in the way he held that coffee cup with both hands that told me everything. We finished by 2 in the afternoon, 1,140 bushels out of a field every professional in Cass County had declared a total loss. The bank got its payment 3 days later. Earl called me on a Thursday evening to tell me so. He didn't make a speech about it. He said, the notes cleared, and then he said, I owe you. And I told him the debt was settled the day he helped me pull my truck out of the East Ditch in January of 1987. And we left it at that. The combine went back into my shed. I changed the belts, greased every fitting, and hung the shop light back on its nail. It sits there now the same as it always has, between the workbench and the old grain auger, patient as a stone. People ask me sometimes why I never sold it for scrap. I tell them I don't have a good answer for that. The truth is, I just never believed a thing that still works deserves to be treated like it's finished. That's the whole of what I know. If you've got something old that people keep telling you to give up on, a machine, a piece of ground, a way of doing things that nobody does anymore, maybe hold on a little longer. Sometimes the world comes around to needing exactly what it laughed at. If this story meant something to you, I'd be glad if you'd share it. And if you've got your own piece of old iron with a story behind it, leave it in the comments. I'd like to hear it.